Okay, good evening and welcome to the May 21st meeting of the Santa Monica Rent Control Board. This meeting is being conducted via video conference in an effort to reduce the spread of coronavirus. Members of the public wishing to participate or provide public comments must have requested that via email by 4:30 p.m. on the day of the meeting. You can request it at rentcontrol@smgov.net, including for future meetings that will be conducted via teleconference. And we can start with a call to order and a roll call, please.
Commissioner Foster.
Here.
Commissioner Terosas.
Here.
Commissioner Duran.
Here.
Commissioner Sultan.
Here.
And Chair Phyllis.
Here.
All members present.
Great. Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from May 14, 2020, which was last week. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I reviewed them. I move to accept the minutes.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
So there's a motion by Commissioner Foster and a second by Vice Chair Sultan. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Terosas.
Yes.
Commissioner Foster.
Yes.
Commissioner Sultan.
Yes.
Commissioner Duran.
Yes.
And Chair Phyllis.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Next item on the agenda is item 6, special agenda items, which consists of announcements pertaining to the Rent Control Board. May we hear from our Executive Director, Ms. Condon, please?
Yes, good evening, Commissioners. As we just met last Thursday, I don't have any new announcements. I will mention once again the survey that we're conducting to try and gather information about whether tenants are having a difficult time paying rent as a result of COVID-19, and we encourage everybody, both property owners and tenants, to complete the survey. You're going to hear about that next, but you can do that from our website at smgov.net/rentcontrol. And that's what I have for announcements this evening.
Great. Does anyone else have any announcements?
Can I ask
hearing
a question?
none.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Commissioner Terosas.
Related to that last announcement, are you going to give us an update during this meeting as to how many people have turned in their surveys and how that's going?
Yes, that's the first item following the public comment section, so you'll hear that next.
Okay.
Great. Hearing no further public announcements, we'll move on to item 12A. I'll note that we do not have any speakers at all who requested to speak on the items tonight. We will be hearing from staff and our commissioners, but no members of the public. Item 12A is the preliminary report on the Rent Control Board's online survey to assess the impact of COVID-19. May I have a staff report, please?
Yes, Dan Costello, the Public Information Manager, will be doing that.
All right, good evening, Commissioners. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Dan.
Great. So, good evening. So I'm first going to begin a little bit about our methodology and how we promoted this survey. So we sent out our spring newsletter at the beginning of May, and that went out to all controlled units and all property owners. So that should be our universe. We followed that up with an email blast we did to our mailing list that has about 1,400 subscribers, and we also, as part of our efforts to increase our email communications, we culled through some recent emails with tenants, and of course, since we've been teleworking, we've been getting a lot more emails. And so we were able to add another 350 plus people to that email list. We also, of course, put it up on our Facebook page, which has 687 subscribers. Put it up on our website. I'm working with the city's Office of Communications to get it out on an email to their list and to the social media channels. Just today, they were able to post it on Facebook and on Instagram. So we're hoping to get more responses as the word gets out. Our information coordinators are also inviting the callers with whom they speak to take the survey. And just as a little bit of a follow-up to last week's agenda item when you were thinking about the calls to the Emergency Operations Center, I just wanted to add that since we've been teleworking, our staff has handled over 1,500 calls. About 4 in 10 of those have some kind of COVID-19 or eviction moratorium into it, but we're definitely part of the overall response. And then lastly, we reached out to the Santa Monica Daily Press, and they were able and kind enough to publish a link to our survey in Monday's article on the general adjustment. So I'd like to say thanks to the Santa Monica Daily Press and to Evelyn Falker for helping us out there. So the contents of the survey was, first of all, we offered it in English and in Spanish, and we asked different questions depending on whether the respondent was a tenant or an owner-manager. So the tenant section had 9 questions, which I will summarize. We asked if tenants have lost work due to COVID-19. We asked if that lost income has created any trouble paying the rent. And then we asked specifically if they were able to pay full rent in April, partial rent, or no rent, and the same in May. And then we also asked them whether they were concerned about paying rent in June. And for those, if they didn't pay the full rent, we asked if they followed the guidelines under the eviction moratorium to notify the landlord in writing of their inability to do so. And then to get a kind of a more general sense, we also asked them whether they expect to be living where they are in 6 months' time. I think when we were drafting this, we were thinking maybe that the repayment would have to be in 6 months, although it's now 12 months after the moratorium ends. And the last question we asked them was how closely we tried to get a sense of how closely their financial situation is tied to the local Santa Monica economy. So we asked, did they work, or do they work mostly in Santa Monica or mostly outside Santa Monica? For the owners, we asked 7 questions. First, we wanted to know how many units do they own or manage. And then of those, how many units did not pay full rent in April and May, and how many they expect might not pay full rent in June. So if they had tenants who did not pay a full rent, we asked them if they were notified in writing as the tenants were supposed to do. And although it is not a requirement for protection under the eviction moratorium, we also asked if landlords were requesting tenants to sign repayment agreements. And finally, we asked if any of them were offering voluntary rent reductions to tenants given the economic hardships that they may be facing. So in total to date, we have received 361 responses. 232 of those responses, really about 2/3, were from tenants, and owners and managers represented the other 129. A couple of these answers or these responses were a bit spurious, as the respondents indicated non-payment rates that seemed wildly inconsistent with everything else that we saw, including a couple of responses that said that 200 of 250 units paid no rent in May, and they expected that none of these 250 units were going to pay in June. So the numbers that I'm going to give you are going to exclude these two responses, but the full numbers are available. So of these 129 owner-manager respondents, they reported that they manage a total of 2,787 units, which is kind of convenient because that is roughly 10% of the total units that are under rent control. So at the year-end last year, we had 27,381. So this is pretty easy to use as a number because we can kind of add a factor of 10 to their responses to extrapolate out to the controlled universe. So before I give you any of the actual results, I just want to make a couple of assumptions about the respondents. So as this was a self-selected survey, it is reasonable to assume that those who have been affected would engage, people who were affected would be the ones to engage in the survey. So tenants who are not paying rent or having concerns are probably more likely to have participated in the survey than the actual percentage of tenants who are out there. And similarly, more property owners who are facing issues are likely to have responded. But with property owners, as they represent and they're reporting on a much larger number of units, we kind of think their responses might be closer to what's actually happening, and probably the responses are somewhere in between what we've learned from the tenants and what we've learned from the landlords. So, just over half of the tenant responded, 56%, reported that they had lost work or had reduced hours due to COVID-19. And another 3% were already out of work when the crisis began. 31% had not lost work, and the remaining 9% are. And of those who lost hours or work, 58% worked mostly in Santa Monica. So although 56% of the tenants said that they had lost work, about half of the tenants responded that they had difficulty paying the rent. So for even those who had not lost work, paying rent was a challenge. On average, most respondents, this is 80%, were able to pay April and May rent in full. There was an uptick from 7% of respondents who paid no rent in April to 12% of respondents who paid no rent in May, and an increase from 9% of respondents who paid partial rent in April to 11% who didn't pay in May. But a large number of respondents, and this is 44%, are concerned about being able to pay June rent. Even among those who could pay May rent in full, more than a quarter, 27%, are concerned. It is worse for those who lost income. Among those who lost income, 64% are concerned about June's rent. And for those who weren't able to pay May rent in full, there is widespread concern, as more than 93% said they may have trouble in June. Tenants do seem to have received the message, though, that they need to notify their landlord of their inability to pay rent. Of those who reported not paying full rent, 90% said they gave notice. Still, 1 in 6 of them was doubted by the landlord. So we asked that general question about, do you expect to be living here 6 months? And that revealed a lot of uncertainty. Overall, about 11% thought that they might not be living where they are. However, among those that paid rent in full in May, only 4% thought that they might be gone in 6 months. Now on to the owner section. So because the owner-manager section asked them to aggregate the non-payment answers across all of their properties, responses are a little bit harder to evaluate by property. The median number of units owned by the owner-manager respondents was 8 units, and the average was 23. And again, they reported on about 2,700 units. So overall, the picture painted by the owner responses don't look as bad as the way the tenants presented it. So, and again, maybe that's because the tenants, the tenant respondents are the ones who are personally feeling the situation and are more likely to have responded. But compared to 16% of tenants reporting less than full payment of April rent, owner responses indicated 9% of units did not pay full rent. Compared to 23% of tenants reporting less than full payment of rent in May, owner responses indicated 11% of units did not pay full rent. So by number, owners indicated that 247 units did not pay full rent in May, and 312 did not pay full rent. 247 did not pay full rent in April, and 312 did not pay full rent in May. But when you consider that these responses represent about 10% of the controlled universe, you can estimate that 2,470 tenants did not pay full rent in April, and 3,120 did not pay in May. As for June, owners are less pessimistic about rent also. So they predicted that 18% of the units would not pay full rent in June, and tenants, 44% of the tenant respondents thought that they would have trouble in June. And then as for the noticing issue, there is some disparity over the number of tenants who have provided. So 90% of tenants said that they had given notice of anything less than full payment to their landlord, but owners reported only about 80% of some or all units giving them notice. Just to wrap it up then, so we did not include a comment section. We were trying to get a picture of how widespread the issue of non-payment is, not how great any one person's difficulty is. And we got some comments from people who submitted that, and they wanted to be able to tell us a little bit more of their story. And we can forward their emails if you'd be interested. But there are a lot of unknown factors that went into these numbers. I comment that some tenants said they were worried about paying rent because they hadn't yet received their stimulus check, or more importantly, they were signing up for unemployment, but they hadn't gotten their checks yet, and so that was causing them some concern. And last, I just say that although the median rents are pretty high here, we would expect that tenants will avail themselves of whatever aid is available, and for those with very high rents, we hope that their personal financial situation would be robust enough to allow them to continue to pay rent. But as Ms. Condon said, this survey is still open, and we invite both landlords and tenants to go to our website, gov.net, and take the survey. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I see Commissioner Foster.
Thank you. Dan, thanks for that report. When you said we could potentially extrapolate out by a factor of 10, that 200 means 2,000 or 300 means 3,000, I was kind of also going back to what you said at the very beginning, though, is that maybe people most affected would be the ones taking the survey at all. But then again, we did our best. We don't know the distribution of the survey. I think all of us have tried personally in each of our capacities to send it among our own networks, on Facebook pages and Nextdoor and everywhere we could think of to send it. We are looking for that information. And of course our hearts go out to everybody who's struggling, in this mess. What are your plans for keeping the survey open, for exactly how long, and what further venues are you planning on pushing it?
So next week, we're going to get the benefit of the city's mailing list. So on Tuesday, they will be sending it out in Samo News. They're on a reduced publication schedule right now. They're only doing Family News on every Tuesday and only a few posts a week, as I understand it. But we'll keep the survey open, I think, until it's obvious that we aren't going to get many more responses. Typically, once the message goes out, we get, a peak in responses, and then it trails off fairly quickly after that. We, lose share of mind and people move on. So I would estimate maybe another couple weeks, another week and a half, something like that, probably through the end of this month.
Okay, Commissioner Trosis.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. That was very helpful. I would just say that for me, 361 responses is not statistically significant, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not a statistician, but that seems extremely low. I'm very heartened to hear about all they sound all what I would have done, and of course, like Commissioner Foster alluded to, I put it on my social media, I emailed out to my networks, and I think that it's disappointing to me that we only have this many responses, but I think to me that indicates that people aren't that concerned, because if people were really concerned, everyone would be filling this out, and they'd be filling it out rapidly to let us know what was going on. I think you could extrapolate this thing with the 10% of units covered, but I don't feel super comfortable with that. So to me, this doesn't tell me a whole lot, if I'm being completely honest. It actually kind of tells me that I feel a little relieved, really, that we haven't had that many responses. I'm still going to be waiting to see what happens when we send it out citywide. I guess we'll have to look at it there. I will tell you, I went into the survey myself, so I'm very familiar with the questions. And there's also nothing preventing me, who's not a renter or a landlord here, from filling it out. So nothing to prevent fake responses. It's very hard to take any. I mean, again, that's no knock on you. I think hopefully with the new rent database, with our new system, when we're able to collect more email addresses that are associated with specific units, we can send out very targeted emails where we know that the person who's affiliated with a specific unit is filling it out. Here, we don't necessarily know that. So I appreciate all the efforts. I hope that we get more responses, but it's hard for me to draw any conclusions from the information.
Okay. Seeing no other requests to speak, I'll thank Mr. Costello for the thorough report. Look forward to hopefully getting more information. I think Commissioner Trosis' point about this isn't like a statistically significant sample is important. Trying to increase the response rate obviously would be great. I'm heartened at least to know that I think last week we were at 200, and then between last week and now, we've had almost, 150 more responses. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there?
Yes, and about 1,500 more units represented. So.
Okay. So and the total number of, I think I heard it, but I just want to make sure I hear it correctly. For the general public's knowledge, the total number of rent-controlled units in Santa Monica is
27,318, I think.
Okay. And the number of unit responses we had for this one was
2,750 something. I'm sorry, I closed my document so I could see you.
Yeah. No. I just wanted to make sure that I was processing all of the numbers. Sometimes it's hard to do it verbally as opposed to seeing it on paper, so that obviously we have information, but so it sounds like it's about a 10% response rate.
That's right. So our response was 2,787. I'm sorry. 20. Response on 2,787 units. We have a total of 27,381 controlled units, and our total responses on the survey were 361.
Okay. And how long is the survey open for, just so we all know?
as I said, I foresee we can leave it open until the end of the month, or a time it seems like we're not going to get significantly more response.
Okay, so no imminent closing of the survey response.
Right.
Okay. Thanks so much for your report. And next item on the agenda is for the third quarter report for fiscal year 2019-2020. Here you have a staff report, please.
Yes. So the main purpose of tonight's meeting is to review the proposed budget for the coming fiscal year, for us to answer your questions about the budget, and to receive any direction from you on any changes you'd like to consider, and then to set the budget for public hearing and adoption on June 11th. But before we do that, it's helpful to review the board's experience as of the third quarter of the current fiscal year. The board just received a mid-year report last month, so tonight we're just providing a brief update. The written report you received and that is posted on our website provides additional details. Our current projections show that by year end, revenue is expected to be approximately $138,000 higher than the $5,311,000 we originally anticipated in the budget. The variation is due primarily to higher than anticipated collection of registration fees. It now appears that expenditures will be approximately $48,000 less than the adopted expenditures of $5,270,000. Savings of about $17,000 in the salary and wages lines for permanent employees and about $69,000 in supplies and expenses will offset the projected over expenditures of about $38,000 in our capital outlay section. The bottom line is that given the increased revenue collections and the overall reduced expenditures, we anticipate the originally projected small surplus of about $42,000 will be increased to $228,000 by year end. The third payment to the city of $50,000 for the loan on the PERS prepayment will be transferred to the city at the end of the fiscal year, leaving approximately $178,000 to be added to the board's fund balance. So that just gives you a sense of this year's revenue and expenditures, and that helps inform our discussion of next year's recommended and proposed budget. So now I would ask that if you have any questions, Ms. Noseworthy and I are happy to answer them. Otherwise, we can move ahead and talk about next year's proposed budget.
Commissioner Foster, sorry, I was on mute.
Thanks. So as always, I mean, you guys are amazing at sticking to your proposals and your goals. In light of COVID and everything that's happened, and your inability to hire those couple of positions, it was funny because when I was reading the section about not being able to fill those 3 slots, there was this huge, surplus. But then it got eaten in overtime and as needed. And I know that as needed is not something that's in any way, shape, or form easy to predict by its very nature. But can you talk a little bit about the overtime? Because as a small business owner myself, overtime is blows my mind. So can you tell us a little bit about what kind of things overtime was spent on in this budget?
Well, as you know, we've been working on the replacement of the rent database, and that project is on top of the other work that we are normally doing. So some of the people who have been putting a lot of energy into the database replacement project have been working significant amounts of overtime in order to be able to complete their regular work as well as this additional project. Additionally, when we do public meetings, sometimes those are done on overtime when the information coordinators or analysts attend those meetings. That's primarily what accounts for the overtime last year. Would you like to add anything, Ms. Noseworthy?
Sorry, I was muted. No, that pretty much covers it.
I almost feel like if there's a lot of overtime attributed to the project, then it's almost like the overtime should be part of the project's budget.
Yeah, that's not the way it works. I understand what you're saying. We are not projecting that amount of overtime in next year because we're hoping, our plan is to have the system implemented early or in the fall, and then hopefully we will not have that need for overtime.
Okay. But again, I'd like to stress that I'm always shocked and amazed at how our agency year after year comes so razor close in our budgets and projections, and always tight control of our expenses and revenues. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Ms. Noseworthy, who really does an excellent job of predicting expenditures and tracking future or past trends and future what they will be. So, all right. Any other questions about the third quarter, or should we move to next year's budget?
I think we can move to next year's budget.
Okay. So this is a study session, very informal, so please feel free to stop me and ask any questions. So, as you know, the rent control law provides that before July 1st of each year, the board must hold a public hearing and adopt an annual budget for the coming year. To finance the board's reasonable and necessary operating expenses, the board charges landlords an annual per unit registration fee. Owners who pay the fee on time and are in compliance with the law may pass through half of the fee to tenants as a monthly surcharge on their rent. The proposed budget represents our best estimate of the board's revenue and expenditures for the coming year. Because it predicts future events, it's an educated prediction, but as always, we strive to be as accurate as possible while conservatively projecting likely income and expenses. The proposed operating budget for fiscal year 2021 projects operating expenditures of $5,287,331 and revenue of $5,252,737, resulting in a small projected deficit of approximately $35,000. For the fourth year in a row, the budget is based upon a $198 per unit registration fee. And despite the small proposed deficit, we're not recommending an increase in the registration fee this year. Like this year, the upcoming year will be another one of change for the agency. With the continuing public health emergency and the recommendation that people telework as much as possible, it's likely that we will have fewer people in the office at any one time. We'll also be making social modifications to our public counter and work areas to ensure social distancing and safety for both our staff members and the public that we serve. This year, we will finally implement the new property and rent tracking system, the cost of which was allocated by the board with adoption of the fiscal year 18-19 budget, and which we've been working on in earnest since February of 2019. Once the database is implemented, our longtime IT staff member will retire. We anticipate hiring his replacement at the beginning of the fiscal year, which will allow for 2 to 3 months of overlap for training and transition purposes. That position will reside in the city's Information Services Department and will be assigned to provide support for the agency's Infor database implementation, on-base document management system, and the other agency technology needs. The salary and benefit costs for that position are included within the proposed budget. The legal secretary retired at the end of 2019, and an administrative staff assistant will be hired to provide support to the legal department. There's a very slight chance that one of the employees who is being laid off by the city due to the city's restructuring could qualify for this position. If that happens, we'll fill the position at the beginning of this fiscal year. Otherwise, the recruitment will take a few months and that position will likely be filled in the fall. So now I would like to talk generally about the expenses. As in the current year, the board's fiscal year 2021 budget reflects both operating expenses, which I'll speak about in a few minutes, and a couple of additional expenditures, including the continuing capital improvement to replace the database and a fourth payment on the loan that the board received from the city in 2017 to accelerate the paying down of the city's unfunded pension liability. A previously planned additional PERS payment to further accelerate the paydown of the agency's unfunded pension liability will not occur this year. As part of their response to the city's current financial crisis, the City Council plans to extend this PERS accelerated payment plan from 13 to 15 years and defer the planned payments for fiscal years 2021 and 21-22. Therefore, the board is not allocating funds for this paydown next year. Before we look at the budget expenditures, I'd like to mention a couple of things about agency staffing levels and review the goals we're proposing for the coming year. So I'm going to now share my screen, and if there's any problem, please let me know, but I'll try to share my screen. Sorry.
There we go.
All right, so you're seeing the agency organization chart. In a service organization like ours, the major resources are the people who provide services to the community and advise the board. In fiscal year 2021, the agency will have 24 positions. During the time of overlap between the programmer analyst and his replacement, we'll have 25 employees, but that will be for a limited time. In addition to our permanent staff members, a few as-needed or temporary employees will continue to assist us as necessary. Although it's difficult to predict how petition filings will be affected by the public health emergency, it's prudent to anticipate some need for as-needed hearing officer assistance. Additionally, a temporary employee will continue to assist the hearings department by handling most of the mediations related to decreased petitions and excess rent complaints. Finally, a retired information analyst will likely assist the public information department during the busy summer months and possibly while a new information coordinator is hired and trained, as we currently have a vacant information coordinator position. We've allocated $47,000 in the upcoming budget to cover the cost of as-needed employees. So the next few slides will show the agency's goals for the coming year. New this year is our goal to ensure that the board can continue to carry out its essential functions during and in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. Included within this goal area are ensuring that all staff and members of the public comply with public health guidelines when conducting business with or for the board. Thoughtfully using board resources to ensure continuity of operations, including adapting processes through the use of technology or other means as necessary to continue to provide the full range of the board's services, and continuing to use the board's website to provide information from other government entities that bears on the board's work or affects the board's constituents. Under our continuing goal of increasing efficiencies through the use of technology, we have two major priorities. First is continuing to enhance the services we provide by modernizing our communication strategies through increased use of electronic communications, social media campaigns, and expanded email lists. And as we've mentioned, the long-awaited implementation of the new property and rent tracking database will increase efficiencies and improve the user experience through electronic workflows, improved reporting capabilities, a web-based self-serve portal for landlords and tenants, improved access to property-specific documents, and case management for petitions and applications. When the system is fully implemented, before it's implemented, we're going to conduct constituent training in using the system to file forms and petitions, pay fees, and access documents in the agency's property site files. And as I've mentioned, we just recently provided access to all of our site file documents from 2005 to the present, and those can be accessed via a link on our website. We also, of course, the ever-important goal of ensuring compliance with the rent control law. We'll plan for any possible changes in state laws that could impact Santa Monica's rent control law, and we'll communicate those changes to tenants and property owners. We will also initiate civil actions as necessary to enforce compliance with the rent control law, and we'll continue to pursue unpaid registration fee balances through collection activities and small claims court. And we will also continue implementation of the agency's document retention schedule to facilitate responses to public records requests. And the final two goal areas are collaborating with other city departments on common goals and preparing for staff changes. We'll continue to collaborate with a number of city departments to ensure that property owners and tenants understand their rights, responsibilities, and obligations. And we will work with the city's Information Services Department to ensure that rent control information remains prominent and easy to access as they redesign the city's website. As I mentioned earlier, we'll experience another retirement this year and likely have 3 new employees. That means that our continued cross-training of existing staff, effective succession planning, and training of new staff will continue to be a priority in the coming year. So before I go on to talk about the actual budget itself, I want to stop sharing my screen and see if you have any comments or things that you'd like to discuss about the goals in particular. Commissioner Terosas, your mic is not on. Oh.
Yeah, hi. I just want to commend you on putting this together. I think so far on the goals, the improving service delivery through the use of technology, you know, I'm very into that, and I fully support that goal. I'm really excited to see. I did see that it's going to take us, I think, a little bit longer here to roll out the rent database, but that's okay. I'd rather get it right. And I think that, you know, we're really trying to move ourselves here in a new direction. Hopefully, even as a result of COVID, I can only speak for myself, it's really accelerated our timeline, taking some of our processes remote, digital, making sure it's easier, especially for people who might have extenuating circumstances to access our services, all of that, accessibility, transparency, very, very in line with everything I've always said here. So I applaud you on that, and I'm fully supportive of that goal.
Thank you. Yes, I think COVID-19 pushed us forward in terms of the use of technology. Here we are holding board meetings using Blue Jeans and teleconference, and everybody moving to work from home basically over the course of a weekend was pretty phenomenal. But I think the timing is really wonderful for our database once it's released, because it will provide that online portal access via the web for the filing of all of our forms, and which for both tenants and property owners will facilitate being able to do that when it's convenient for them. And the document access means people don't have to come into our office to be able to look at those documents. They may want to contact us and talk about the documents, and we're here to answer any questions. And of course, we're happy when City Hall is open to have people come in. But it's, you know, I think our timing, we're very fortunate that we are where we are with respect to the database, and it should be up and running by the fall.
Yeah, and then I would also just say, not that this is like maybe an unintended consequence, but the reduction in vehicle miles traveled for the lack of people needing to actually physically go into the office, you know, whether it's staff or constituents. I love that we're using our vehicles less and hopefully creating a more climate-friendly community. So thanks.
Okay. All right. If there are any other questions, then we'll go on to the expenditures. And you all have a budget book, I believe. So that's behind, the chart is behind the tab that says proposed 2021 agency budget. And I'm going to share my screen again. It's an abbreviated version of the budget. It doesn't have all of the line items, but it has summaries. So just a moment. All right. So the fiscal year 2021 budget maintains the current operations of the agency. It includes funds for 2 newsletters and the summer mailing, plus 1 additional mailing to inform property owners and tenants about the enhanced services and processes that will be available through the new database that we were just talking about. We anticipate presenting 5 or 6 seminars throughout the year, including hopefully a tenant seminar in Spanish and a new seminar on the new rent system. Of course, if the public health emergency limits our ability to conduct these seminars in person, we will conduct them via teleconference or webinar. The budget includes funds for 1 to 2 board meetings per month and provision of the highest level of public service in our day-to-day operations. The proposed expenditures for fiscal year 2021 in the right-hand orange column is $5,287,331. As I mentioned earlier, the major resources of our agency are the people who provide services to the public. And the first line on this table shows the funding for staff salaries, deferred compensation, and other payouts provided by the Memoranda of Understanding with the board's bargaining unit. This allocation also includes costs associated with the anticipated retirement I've mentioned. The compensation for as-needed employees I mentioned earlier is reflected in the as-needed employees line item. Health insurance costs continue to rise with a projected increase of 5.9% as of January 2021. Some of the insurance costs are offset by employee contributions towards the cost of the premium for their selected health care plan. The retirement contributions in line 513000 are set at a contribution rate of 25.967% of staff salaries. And just as a reminder, the agency does not pay into Social Security for our employees, so PERS is essentially the equivalent of Social Security for private sector employees. In the supplies and expenses section of the budget, I want to just mention a couple of things. The city assesses the agency for various services such as maintenance of office space and services provided by the Departments of Human Resources, Finance, Purchasing, Facilities Maintenance, and Information Systems. You'll find details about these charges referred to as indirect costs on pages 5 through 9 of the budget. The $306,000 in this line represents no increase in cost over last year's allocation. Cable costs for televising 13 board meetings and $25,000 for election costs to fill 2 board seats in the 2020 election are in the other costs line item. The proposed budget allocates $20,000 in legal expenses. This allocation covers the direct costs of litigation, document delivery to the courts, outside counsel if needed, depositions, and potential legal liabilities. If the board's legal fees are higher than $20,000, which we don't anticipate this year, the board has a designated reserve of approximately $42,000 for legal expenses. If there's a need, these funds can be moved into the current fiscal year's allocations with board approval. And while the agency is transitioning in the coming year from the rent database to its in-for replacement, it will be necessary to maintain service agreements for components of both. This will be a one-time occurrence, and the service agreements in future budgets will be approximately $15,000 less. The capital outlay section totals $47,500, which in addition to covering physical modifications to the public counter area, which I mentioned earlier, the cost of computer-related purchases and the lease on the copier. It also includes $14,000 in payments for participation in the city's computer equipment replacement program, which provides for computer replacements every 4 years, ensuring that the agency is able to take advantage of newer computer technology and maintain functionality with the rest of the city's systems. Lyman and I will be happy to answer any questions you have about any specific line items or general questions. So I'll stop sharing again before I move on to the revenue section. Anything you'd like to discuss about the expenditures? All right. Commissioner Trosis?
Yeah, sorry. So are we concerned that the legal budget is very low considering what we've seen in years past, and can we potentially be cautious there?
We actually are being cautious there. This year's projection for potential legal expenses is consistent with what it has been historically. In the last couple of years, it was uncharacteristically high because of an existing case that we had for which we had to use outside counsel. The reasons for which we had to use outside counsel in that case are unlikely to be repeated in the coming year.
Okay, as long as you feel confident, then I trust you.
I do. I believe that we actually will have a little bit of. I believe that if our experience in the coming year is as it was in past years, we probably will have a little bit that we'll be able to move over.
Okay, and then I would just say that I know that this isn't nice because we have a lot of work to do, but I would limit overtime to the extent possible.
Yes, I'm hoping that when we're done with the database, we will not see the amount of overtime, and you see that we've allocated less, significantly less this year.
Do you guys have exempt employees that just get comp time instead of overtime?
Yes, we do.
We
But
make
not-
them.
Pardon?
Okay. All right, never mind. Okay.
They're not the people working on the database, though. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, sure. All right, so then we'll move on to revenue. And the revenue section of your budget book is behind the next tab, proposed revenue projection. And I'll share my screen again. All right, so total revenue projected for 2021 is approximately $5,253,000. And that, as I mentioned earlier, is based upon a per unit registration fee of $198. We anticipate billing 26,425 units this year. And the difference between the numbers Mr. Costello gave you earlier and these numbers are the fee waivers that are granted to low-income and seniors and disabled tenants, units that are occupied by Section 8 tenants or tenants with Section 8 vouchers, and owner-occupied units. In addition to the registration fees for the coming year, we anticipate collecting approximately $6,000 of past due fees from previous years for a total of $5,238,000 in registration fees. During the year, as certain units become eligible for fee waivers or are granted exemptions, refunds are issued to owners. We anticipate refunds of approximately $12,000. The other major source of revenue in previous years has been interest earnings on city invested rent control funds. The sources contributed less to our revenue in recent years due to low interest rates. The city treasurer is estimating a rate of return on invested funds for the next year of 0.5%, resulting in anticipated interest earnings of just over $20,000. The other sources of revenue are fairly de minimis and include $2,000 for administrative record charges, $2,200 in filing fees, and $1,800 in miscellaneous charges, altogether totaling $6,000. So as I mentioned earlier, with the projected revenue and expenditures, we're anticipating a small deficit of $34,594, and any deficit that remains at the end of the fiscal year will be covered by the board's reserves. So I just, now I want to thank Ms. Noseworthy and Mr. Gwynn for their hard work in preparing the budget. Mr. Gwynn has been helping Ms. Noseworthy more and more, and I want to thank them. So I'll stop sharing and I can answer any questions. Lyra and I can answer any questions that you have. And then I want to take a minute to talk about a possible program we'd like you to consider about possibly deferring rent registration fee payments, but we'll hold on we'll hold for that until after we've finished discussing the budget. Are there any questions? All right, then. So we will set this budget as it is for public hearing on June 11th, the same night that we'll be holding the public hearing on whether or not to apply a ceiling to the general adjustment. But one other thing we wanted to talk with you about this evening is the idea of possibly allowing some property owners to defer payment of registration fees on units in which tenants are not paying the full rent. Those tenants who have been impacted by COVID-19 in one way or the other and are not paying their rent. We've heard from some property owners that they feel we should waive registration fees entirely. Clearly, we're not able to do that. The board's all of our services are financed by the registration fee. But what we could do, if the board was interested, would be to allow owners who are not receiving the full rent to defer their payment, and we would probably recommend until December, which would give them some time to recoup the deferred rent from the tenants. We would require them before the due date of the registration fee, which is August 1st. This year it will be the 3rd because the 1st is a Saturday. But we would require them to submit a reg fee deferral form and a copy of the notice that they received from the tenant. And then we would not charge any penalties on those fees as long as they were paid in full by the beginning of December. And an owner would be able then to pass through implement the general adjustment and the pass-through of the registration fee after the fees were paid in full and after giving proper notice to the tenants. So part of the reason we did the survey that Mr. Costello explained to you earlier was so we could get an idea of how many units might this be and how big of a universe. As you see, we don't really know. Your presumption that possibly there aren't as many people impacted, that would be wonderful if that's the case and not as many people have been impacted. But we have heard generally that, in some places 1 in 5 tenants have been impacted. We don't see those types of numbers. And again, we're not talking about waiving the fees entirely, but just deferring their payment. So we're curious to hear your thoughts about that. And if you're interested in considering that, we would draft a regulation and bring that to you for public hearing also on June 11th.
So I don't see anyone in the queue. Now I see Commissioner Foster. Why don't you go ahead?
So we're not voting on this possible deferral item tonight, are we?
No, you're not. You're just giving us some direction if you'd like us to draft a regulation. The reason that we need your direction tonight is because if you do decide you'd like to adopt something like this, we need a regulation in place before we send out the bills at the end of June. So we're moving into that time frame.
So here's my concern. At first, when I read this, I thought that's a no-brainer. Of course, if we're willing to do it and we can absorb it and carry it over in the meantime or run a deficit, I thought, if somebody is that adversely affected, I considered it for a second, and then I started thinking again that unless it was somebody who could prove it was an extreme percentage of their units that were directly affected by COVID and yet were still occupied, the complexity of such a program for your staff to prorate different units, different numbers of units, then recalculate when it's reinstated, when it may be paid, when it may be not. It's not, I'd rather see the full general adjustment go forward, but not forgive reg fees. I mean, I think keeping it simple and staying the course, we stayed the course through the Great Recession. and that was potentially much longer reaching and many more vacancies and, impactful than hopefully COVID will be. But I was intrigued by this idea at first, but I would definitely need to see a caveat that there's something beyond, one apartment at $8 a month impacting landlords with 70% market rates in their building. That's kind of where I'm starting on this.
I saw Commissioner Trosis has a hand, and then I'll put myself in the queue after Commissioner Trosis.
Okay, question. If landlords are not making a fair return, could they avail themselves of the rent decrease process?
Rent increase?
Increase process. Yes.
Right, yeah. If they can prove that if they could prove, okay, maybe this is, let's say that people aren't paying their rent. Does that factor into this? No. No. Okay.
No. The purpose of the fair return process is to ensure that the level at which rents have been set.
Yeah. Okay.
Depriving of. If things extraneous to what the board itself, the limit that the board itself has imposed on the amount of rent that can be charged, then no, it's not relevant.
Got it.
So it's not like a hardship. It's not like a hardship increase. It's
correct.
Right. Okay. And then I guess I should have said this, a few meetings ago, but it would have been helpful to know what percentage of our landlords are taking advantage of PPP and EIDL loans, because I know, I'm married to someone that owns a family business. My father has a small business. I know at work I've helped hundreds of small business owners, and there is federal regulation on the books to assist individuals who are not receiving income as a result of their business, and that is the situation for landlords. And so there are PPP and EIDL loans. I understand PPP has to be paid to payroll, and so that's an issue. But for economic injury disaster loans, this is an economic injury, and I would hope that all of our landlords have gone to the Small Business Administration and applied for any of those loans to the extent that they can. I believe EIDL has a 30-year repayment period, so effectively very, very low monthly payments back. I agree with Commissioner Foster. To me, this idea was very intriguing at the beginning, and now I do have some concerns about the practical implementation. As someone who implements policy often, I would be concerned that we're making policy that could have unintended consequences. So that's where I'm at, especially after hearing the survey results.
So I think I'm next in the queue. I think I'm still in the I'm intrigued phase. I may move past it. What I would like to hear, I guess, from our executive director, and I don't think this is something necessarily you can give now, but I think if this is agendized at the next meeting, I'd like to hear a cost-benefit analysis. What are the costs of administration of this type of program to the board? What type of relief will it afford to property owners? What type of fiscal impacts will it have on the board aside from administration costs? I think I'm certainly open to it, but I don't think without that information we can assess whether this is going to be worth to property owners the cost to the board. So, I like it because I think I like the idea of it, and I like the fact that we're being cognizant that some smaller property owners in particular may be struggling with this crisis. I think this is something that we've all expressed concern about. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm kind of open in terms of the concept, certainly not gung-ho about it, would love some more information. And definitely hear what the concerns of my fellow commissioners. My inclination is unless the amounts afford enough, unless the amounts actually that we expended in terms of registration fee payment obligations for property owners would really provide the type of relief that I think they're looking for and the scale of relief that they're looking for. I think maybe our limited resources may be expended, better in a different direction. But I think part of it also, I would like some opportunities to talk with stakeholders in our landlord community to see if this is something that they even want. Because I think, we owe it to them as well to have those conversations.
So, to your comments, we are thinking of a very simple fee waiver application type process. Of course, the more complex it gets in terms of any analysis of how many units does the person have and, what income are they receiving, that would make the program much more complex. We envision a very simple program, and it's a deferral of payments. So we would ultimately collect all of the registration fees. But if it were, say, 3,000 units on which owners applied for this deferral, that would be just short of $600,000. And we could get through the first 4 months of the year without that $600,000. We need it ultimately, but the idea would be it would be paid, by December 1st or sometime in December. I did speak with a few property owners. They expressed, they thought it was a nice idea, that it was good that the board would consider such a thing. The couple of people I spoke with did not feel that they would avail themselves of it because they would prefer to implement the general adjustment in September if they're going to implement it rather than wait until later in the year, and to be able to pass through all of the registration fee or the half that goes to the tenant over the whole time period rather than losing those months where the fee was not paid and they wouldn't be able to pass that through to the tenant. So there were some mixed feelings. I too kind of liked the idea more when we first thought of it, and then as we thought about it a bit more, I thought, well, I'm not sure how helpful this would be, but it's something worth us talking about. So that's why we brought it to you tonight.
Great. And Commissioner Duran, I saw you had a hand. I didn't want you to get left behind.
Thank you. Yeah, I do have a couple comments. I think some of the points that Ms. Condon made ring true for me. I'll highlight them. I mean, it's simple, I think, is important because then it does have a consequence on the amount of staff time and hours required to work out the nuances. I think, though, that if it was needs-based and there was evidence of need, and also to remember that this isn't a forgiveness of the fee. It's just a delay. We're still going to get it, and the question is, can we sustain ourselves with that delay? The indication we got earlier tonight from how many people have responded and commented on was very low. So, I don't know at this point, there's not enough information to know how many landlords there are that are in dire straits and that have evidence of need. So the number may be very small. We just have to see. We don't know. But I think as a policy standpoint, I think what's important is to allow for the opportunity out of a sense of fairness. Tenants on a need base with evidence of being unable to pay rent does cause a consequence on landlords, whether they can put it or not. It is a consequence. And that, I think, is true of landlords too. Maybe not a lot of them. Maybe there are those who are getting a large percentage of their rent from become market rate, and it won't affect them, and it's better off for them just to continue to pay what their current reg fees are, and move forward. But there might be some that are it does make a difference, and again, we're not forgiving the registration fee. We're just giving them a delay so that if they think it would help them to wait it out for the 6 months or however many it is to pay us in full, then they do so, and then have the consequences after that if they don't, which I know Ms. Condon spoke of in terms of past fee pass-throughs and fines, etc. Those still stay in place. So those are my thoughts. I think maybe even a deadline for landlords to file if they feel they'll need. I know the PPPs had a deadline with which small businesses needed to submit the application or to be granted the loans. Maybe if we have an early deadline too of those landlords based on the information they have, they're going to need the help, in the next month or so. We can then get a projection of, well, how much is this going to be a dip into our reserves, and can we sustain ourselves? Because the other side of the coin is, you're right, we can't not have the funds to maintain the rent control board, right? So we can't give away the farm, so to speak. But if we can help and get it back by the end of the year, it ends up being no loss, and it was a helping hand, I think that's a good policy. That's
Great.
it. Thank you.
Okay, I think our next speaker is Commissioner Sultan was in the queue, and then Commissioner Trossis will come back to you.
There we go. So I've also wavered a little bit on this. I've wavered and resulted in not having terribly strong feelings about it, which is, I don't know, a little unusual for me. I think, I thought it sounded like a good idea when some of my fellow commissioners were discussing, finding out whether landlords are really hurting based on what's going on in their other units before granting this deferral, and then I realized that would just be a very difficult administrative process. And in order to be worth it, potentially for anybody, it would have to be easy. So I hear that obviously, from my perspective, would have to be what we implemented if we did implement this. That it was like a simple, I don't have a tenant in this unit, delay the fee. But I do, the more I think about it, the more it just doesn't sound particularly. I just wonder, the utility of this to landlords, because it's not actually that much money. And if there's a small, I don't know, I guess you could imagine a small landlord for whom none of the tenants are paying rent, and, but I don't think that's, I haven't heard that that's the case, right? It's, it's like approximately 10%. And then I do, if they have to pay it by December, tenants will still have that, their rents will still be deferred. So I just don't know how helpful it'll be, but I don't think it's like a bad idea. I mean, I feel like it's nice for us to, try and do what we can within our limited kind of toolbox. And if this is something that will be useful to some people, I could potentially support it.
Okay, Commissioner Trossis.
So I actually have in my notes here, and Commissioner Duran made a point that I wanted to reinforce. So again, hearing all of you is very helpful because it reinforces what I'm thinking, which was, again, nice at the beginning now, not sure that it's that useful, would rather just make sure that people are paying the reg fees and that we're doing the general adjustment. And then I agree with Commissioner Duran. I think that if Ms. Condon and Mr. Lewis come back with any sort of proposal in our next meeting, which it sounds like tepid interest to give people more time to at least give us some feedback. So it sounds like you might come back with something at our next meeting. I would agree that there needs to be a submission of the deferral request. What I think like significantly before, I understand that we don't have that much time to get all this together, but August 3rd seems like I think that they would need to submit it at least a week in advance, like at least a week or two in advance. I don't like this proposal here in the report that the request would need to be submitted by the registration fee. I think we need to know about that in advance. So that would be the only thing I would direct you to consider. And again, I'm not feeling super enthusiastic, but it doesn't look like we don't have any public comment on this, do we? Yeah.
No, that wasn't an agenda.
I know we've received a lot of written comment, and thank you everyone who submitted their written public comment. That's always helpful. But yeah, I haven't seen anything that's been
Okay, Anastasia.
illuminating. Yeah, go ahead.
Anastasia, sorry, Commissioner Foster.
So another thing that occurred to me was, and Carolyn touched on it for a sec, but there would need to be a line of affirmation in there for landlords to acknowledge whether or not they've sought that federal relief from Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. These are all so what I think we all wanted to be a simple program is just revealing layers and layers and layers of calculations and if I were a landlord and I could take 1.4%, which $1,000 is $14, or not be able to take $14 for saving $8, it seems like a lot of machination to go through for very little gain. We should have things in place that take all the relevant factors into account. And if a landlord's hurting and they can demonstrate it, I'm just not sure this is it. I feel like it's too complex for the simple problem it's trying to tackle. I'm not quite there yet. And it takes, do you need just one of us to ask you to bring back more information? I don't know if I'm ready to hear an entire proposed regulation yet at this point.
Well, I'm sorry, the timing is such that if we wanted to do this, we would have to draft a regulation for the next meeting, because once you decide the general adjustment, whether there's a ceiling or not, we prepare the mailing, we send it out by the end of June along with the registration fee bills. That would be our opportunity to explain the program to people, provide the application. So we have a very short period of time. If this doesn't sound like a good idea, that's perfectly fine. Like I said, I thought it was a good idea when we started talking about it, and then for the reasons you're saying, it may not be. But we would need to keep it very simple. So the idea of assessing whether it's a hardship for the owner, that was not part of what we were thinking. It was, is the tenant paying the full rent or not? Have they provided the notice pursuant to the eviction moratorium? We could ask the question about, have they received or applied for any relief to cover this lost rent? But we were envisioning something very simple. And if we want to get much more complex, I don't know that it's a program that we should put into place in this short of time.
So I'm happy to kind of say in the middle that I'm interested in hearing more about it. I feel like I would like to just have the opportunity to talk with constituents about it. I'm not optimistic that I will ultimately end up pursuing it, but I would like, this is kind of a narrow window, and I would just like the chance to raise this issue with our constituents. But Commissioner Trosis, I know you're in the queue.
Yeah, so it sounds like Commissioner or Chair Phillips is saying let's preserve our right to do something here. So let's come back with something at the next meeting that's not unduly burdensome, because I do understand that you guys have a lot of demands of your time right now, and the last thing I want to do is have you guys run around doing a lot of work on something when your time could be better spent helping our constituents who need this like vital assistance right now. And while we're sitting behind a computer trying to come up with some regulations that are never going to be implemented. So please don't spend like
Commissioner
time. It sounds like we want to, but Commissioner Phillips wants to prove that, right? I mean, are we envisioning this would be like a self-attestation under penalty of perjury? Are we going to look at documents or I mean, because if we're going to look at documents, I think they need to show some sort of loss of revenue as a result of COVID, and then you go down that rabbit hole of verifying documents. So, I guess in the interest of making it simple, I guess we have to do a self-attestation, but is that what you were thinking, Ms. Condon?
Well, because the eviction moratorium requires the tenant to provide written notice to the owner that they are impacted by COVID-19, and that's why they're not able to pay a portion or all of their rent. What we were envisioning is that the owner would provide that copy of the tenant's notice along with a simple form that they would fill out, and that's what they would submit to us with attesting that this is under penalty of perjury, and but not looking at their financial situation, just a very simple, the tenant's not paying the rent, and so I'm asking for this 3-month deferral of the payment of my fee.
Yeah, I think, and sorry, given I'm just very, very risk averse right now, given the entire global budget situation and any sort of impacts that any deferred payment would have. I would really like to minimize our opportunity to do that. So let's say you have a 50-unit building, the owner comes forward with one tenant who has said, oh, I didn't pay rent, and meanwhile the registration fee is a pretty de minimis fee when you take into account all the other things that a landlord has to pay for, and I don't want to unduly handicap us. So that's why I'm just like a little concerned. I guess we can come back with something that's very simple, and I'm fine with that, but I have concerns, and I'm done talking. I'm done.
And I just want to reiterate, I am ambivalent at best about this. I just want to make sure that we are considering all of our options. And Commissioner Drawn, you're next in the queue, will be super brief. I just want to make sure, because this item isn't agendized, if folks have specific line items or parameters that they want Tracy to consider, I would encourage my commissioners, rather than kind of try to legislate this from the dais, to send them to Tracy offline so that they can be presented or considered in the regulation, and that we can address it completely at the next meeting. So it looks like, I think we have Commissioner Drawn, and then Commissioner Sultan, are you raising your hand? Okay, so then you'll be after Commissioner Drawn.
Okay, I have a question for Ms. Condon. It sounds like the issue with the timing of all this is based on notice, just getting the notice to the landlords before the general adjustment, before their. Is that correct? And if so, I'm wondering why we have to set that deadline. I mean, if the need, maybe we could take more time, look at this more thoroughly, and they'll get notice how we're able to give it after. Again, we're not forgiving their registration fees. We're just, if there's a need base and we figure out a way to do it simply, they're able to defer it, then they're able to, then we could do it a little later. Does that make sense?
Well, our proposal, or what we were thinking, is that the registration fees are due by August 1st. So we would want this request for a deferral to also be received at least by that time, but because otherwise we bill late fees for anything that's not paid by August 1st. And our idea here was that we would not be billing late fees for these units if we granted the deferral. So we would need to know by August 1st whether or not they're applying for this, so that we would know whether or not they just didn't pay their fee and should be assessed the penalty or not. So that's why it's in line with the payment of the registration fee, the deadline for the payment.
And if it were to be pushed to the July meeting, would that be too close of a deadline?
Well, then there would be very little time for the owners to apply for it. And we would have already sent our summer mailing out, in which that would be our opportunity to make sure everybody knew about it.
Right.
Right. I understand that point, but okay. All right. Thank you.
Commissioner Sultan, and then I think we're probably close to wrapping up. So, Commissioner Sultan?
I mean, it sounds like, just in response to what Commissioner Duran was suggesting, it would be administrative burdensome to, like, have to send out like a whole separate mailing or something like that. So that's why I asked to fall within those that limited window. I wanted to ask Ms. Condon, and forgive me if this has come up yet, but what would we do with landlords that, or what are we thinking that we would do with landlords that said that they have received partial rent on a unit, right? Like, are we going to say, well, if you received, more than $200 on that unit, then you have to, like, it does seem like it could get a little bit complicated if we were looking at things like partial payments, which I think are a reality. I think folks are trying to negotiate decreased rents with their landlords. So to me, that adds another layer of complication to this. Unless you guys have already thought it through and have a brilliant plan.
Well, no, our simple approach is just, if a tenant has said they're unable to pay a portion or all of the rent, if the board wanted to do this, that fee would be deferred for that unit, regardless whether they paid no rent or a portion of the rent.
So even if they paid like $100 less, then okay.
Right, just to keep it simple.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, I think I have a proposal. It sounds like maybe what we need to do is continue to caucus internally, talk with our constituents, talk with Ms. Condon to see if we have any additional feedback or parameters that we want to make sure that she considers. I would request tentatively that we be prepared to discuss potential regulation at the next meeting, although certainly, as I recognize that I'm the one requesting it, and if I think I may pull it. I may say I have talked to folks and I'm no longer interested in doing that, so I would encourage everyone to do their own research for foster ICU as well. So go ahead.
So as far as like starting to work on it, and then let's say a few of us talk to people and realize this is not a great idea, and we tell her to pull it mid-month before in a couple of weeks, another meeting. Wouldn't this have to go, Tracy, question, wouldn't this have to go straight to public?
Yes.
There's nothing in administrative procedure that prevents that. Like, I'm not worried about that.
Right. You would be seeing a draft of the regulation the night that we would be holding a public hearing on it. And the public would see it. I mean, a week ahead, because we send out the packet and release the documents a week ahead. So that's just 2 weeks from now. The board's next meeting is in 3 weeks. I
thank you for the timing question. This feels too hurried to me to get it right. I don't mean no lack of faith of staff's ability to craft it. I don't mean that. I mean, like, politically thinking all the way ahead to any potential, issues or unintended consequences for such a tiny gain. I don't know. I'm still just against this on simplicity and on. I'm against doing this.
Commissioner Foster, I definitely am hearing you substantively, and I think probably substantively I'm close to where you're at. But I just would like the opportunity to discuss this as an agendized item. Yes, Council.
So I'm very sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to be clear about something for the benefit of the public. A comment was made a couple times that this discussion wasn't on the agenda for tonight's meeting. This is a part of the budget consideration, because the question is our revenue. So I just want the public to know that we are not having this long discussion about something that is not a part of an agendized item. That was all I wanted to say. I didn't want the public to leave the meeting that we were having this discussion going into some substance about something that was not on the agenda. This was not on the agenda as a separate item as a regulation, but it's a part of the board's revenue stream and is discussed in the budget staff report. So thank you very much. I'm sorry to interrupt once again.
Okay, got it. All right, so it sounds like it's coming back at the next meeting. Sounds like there's not a whole lot of support for it right now. And we should continue to work at it until we have a decision, which seems like it may come relatively easily. So if there's no one else who wants to speak on this item, Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I will so move.
Was that a motion, a non-verbal motion? I wasn't sure if you wanted to
No,
speak.
okay, I was going to see Commissioner Duran can be first there.
Okay. Commissioner Duran moved and Commissioner Tarosa seconded. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Sultan?
Yes.
Commissioner Duran?
Yes.
Commissioner Foster?
Yes.
Commissioner Trosas?
Yes.
And Chair Phyllis.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, staff, so much for an amazing budget. I know it's not easy. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and the board's next meeting is June 11th, and we'll have the public hearings on June 11th. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.